Old weapons are easy to misunderstand. We assume they survive because armies are nostalgic, lazy, or trapped by budget. Sometimes that is true. But the Browning M2 is more interesting because its survival is not just a story of age. It is a story of fit. The question is not simply, why is a design from another era still here? The better question is, what would have to change around it for replacement to be worth the trouble? Once you ask that, the M2 stops looking like an antique that refused to leave and starts looking like an anchor inside a much larger system. This video is about that system, design role, institutional habit, logistics, vehicle integration, training memory, and the difference between old and obsolete. It is not about operation, practical employment, or use. The M2 matters historically because it shows how a weapon can become so embedded that replacing the object means replacing part of the institution around it. The first clue is the role. A service rifle lives close to the identity of the individual soldier. A heavy machine gun like the M2 lives differently. It is crew-served, mounted, moved through vehicles, placed into defensive systems, carried in inventories, supported by maintenance channels, and understood as a capability rather than as a personal object. That changes the replacement logic. When a weapon becomes a capability, age alone is not enough to remove it. You need a reason strong enough to disturb mounts, training, parts, ammunition supply, manuals, vehicle layouts, and doctrine. A newer design may be cleaner in one category, but the institution asks a colder question: does it improve enough of the whole system to justify the disruption? The M2's answer for generations has been, not yet. That answer is not glamorous, but it is powerful. A design that survives by not yet survives through comparison, not sentiment. Newer answers appear. Some solve one part of the problem. Some promise lighter weight, different controls, different manufacturing, or different integration. But a successor must do more than look modern. It must make the old system's accumulated advantages seem too expensive to keep. The M2's age therefore becomes a test of our own assumptions. We tend to imagine progress as replacement. A newer object appears, the older object disappears, and the timeline moves forward. Military history is not that tidy. Sometimes progress means keeping the old capability while improving the vehicles, sights, mounts, manufacturing, training, and doctrine around it. The visible object remains familiar while the ecosystem shifts. That does not mean perfection. Longevity should never be confused with magic. The M2 is heavy, old in concept, and tied to a class of weapon that demands respect from the organization using it. But it performs a clear role across many platforms and many decades. The key is not that it has no flaws. The key is that its flaws have been considered manageable beside the cost of replacing a mature ecosystem. If this kind of institutional weapons history is what you want, subscribe after this point. Arsenal Context is built for viewers who want to know why armies keep things, not just what those things are. The M2 began in the world shaped by the First World War and matured into the mechanized violence of the Second. That origin matters because the weapon was never merely a small arm scaled up for drama. It belonged to a world of aircraft, vehicles, anti-aircraft concerns, armored targets, boats, convoys, and fixed positions. Its .50 caliber role sat above the ordinary rifle and below heavier cannon or artillery. That middle space proved extremely durable. Middle spaces are often where longevity hides. A weapon at the edge of a category can be replaced when the category disappears. A weapon in the middle of a persistent gap can remain because the gap keeps returning in new uniforms. The M2's broad category remained legible through World War, Cold War, counterinsurgency, convoy warfare, base defense, and modern vehicle fleets. The missions changed, but many organizations still wanted a heavy automatic weapon in that space. Durable spaces create durable weapons. A rifle can be replaced when the individual infantry model changes. A heavy machine gun can remain if the gap it fills remains. For decades, militaries kept needing something that could sit on a vehicle, support a position, provide heavy automatic fire in broad doctrinal terms, and integrate into existing platforms. The details changed, but the gap did not disappear. This is where the M2 becomes a logistics story. Spare parts, ammunition, mounting systems, training language, and armor familiarity are not background details. They are the reason a design survives. Every depot shelf is a vote. Every instructor who already knows the system is a vote. Every vehicle mount that accepts it is a vote. Every allied army that also uses it is a vote. Replacement has to defeat all of those votes at once. That is why the phrase old design can be misleading. Old compared with what? Old compared with the calendar, certainly. But not necessarily old compared with the job. If the job remains stable enough, and if the system around the weapon remains enormous enough, age can become an advantage. It means familiarity, known failure points, known support requirements, and a large base of institutional experience. There is a dry lesson here: armies are not museums, but they are not technology influencers either. They do not replace a working system just because a cleaner brochure exists. A new weapon must win not only the engineering argument, but the budget argument, the training argument, the vehicle argument, the alliance argument, and the risk argument. That is a lot of arguments. The alliance argument is especially important. A widely used weapon creates shared familiarity across partners. Ammunition supply, manuals, training references, and industrial support do not stop at one national border. The more a system spreads, the more replacement becomes a coordinated problem rather than a private decision. That does not make replacement impossible. It raises the price of being different. There is also a psychology of confidence. Crews and commanders do not only want theoretical capability. They want known behavior. They want a system whose limitations are already mapped, whose maintenance burden is already understood, and whose place in the force does not need to be explained from zero. A mature system earns trust through repetition. A successor has to earn that trust before its advantages can matter at scale. The M2 also benefits from being understandable at the doctrinal level. Its role is not subtle. Commanders and crews know broadly what category of problem it belongs to. That clarity matters. Some weapons disappear because their role becomes ambiguous. They are too heavy for one job, too light for another, too specialized for regular use, or too expensive for broad issue. The M2's role has remained legible. If you think a century-old design surviving this long is brilliance, inertia, or both, put your answer in the comments. The useful answer is probably not one word. It is the balance between technical adequacy and institutional gravity. The middle of the story is replacement. Replacing an old design is easy in conversation and hard in a military. A new system must be tested, funded, introduced, taught, supported, and defended politically. If it fails in service, the old system's uglier virtues suddenly look beautiful. Known limitations are often less frightening than unknown limitations. This is why incremental improvements can beat replacement. Over time, a mature system can receive changes in manufacturing, materials, safety, maintenance procedures, mounts, or variants without losing its institutional identity. The organization can modernize around the same core capability. That is less glamorous than a clean-sheet successor, but it is often how militaries actually behave. The M2's long life also shows the difference between technical design and platform integration. A weapon mounted on vehicles, aircraft historically, naval platforms, or fixed positions is not only judged by its receiver and barrel. It is judged by how it fits the platform, what crew expectations surround it, how ammunition moves, how it is secured, how it is maintained, and how it appears in doctrine. The more places it fits, the harder it becomes to remove. This is where the M2 becomes almost architectural. A building can outlive its original design fashion because roads, utilities, habits, and institutions grow around it. The M2 has done something similar in military form. It appears on vehicles, in storage systems, in training ranges, in allied inventories, and in the mental map of what a heavy machine gun is supposed to provide. Removing it is not like removing a chair from a room. It is closer to changing the room's wiring. That creates a strange kind of power. The weapon becomes almost invisible because it is always there. People stop noticing it as a decision. They notice it only when someone proposes replacing it. Then the hidden system becomes visible: contracts, stockpiles, mounts, manuals, training, allied compatibility, and decades of habit. This is not unique to weapons. It is how old software survives in banks, how old aircraft remain in specialized roles, how old engines keep running in fleets. Replacement is rarely just an object-for-object swap. It is a social and logistical event. The M2 is simply one of the clearest military examples because the calendar makes the question unavoidable. There is also a reputation effect. The nickname, the photographs, the silhouette on vehicles, the repeated appearance across wars, all of this creates a legend. Legend can distort history, but it can also signal something real. A weapon does not become legendary purely because people talk about it. It becomes legendary because enough institutions keep finding a place for it. Still, the legend should be handled carefully. Glorifying the M2 as an eternal answer misses the point. Every system can age out if the surrounding environment changes enough. Drones, remote weapon stations, sensors, lighter systems, heavier systems, and new forms of protection all change the question. The M2's longevity is not a guarantee of permanent relevance. It is evidence that, so far, its role has remained worth supporting in many contexts. That sentence matters because modern battlefields keep creating new pressures. Remote mounts can change how crews interact with weapons. Sensors can change what detection and engagement mean. Light vehicles, heavy vehicles, and improvised threats can all push the boundaries of old categories. The M2 story should not be told as if time stopped in 1945. Its survival is an ongoing negotiation with new platforms and new threats. That distinction matters for any old design. Survival is not proof that something is best. It is proof that replacement has not yet become persuasive enough. Sometimes that means the old design is excellent. Sometimes it means the replacement case is weak. Often it means both. If that distinction is useful, leave a like. It helps more viewers find weapons history that separates engineering reality from nostalgia. The climax of the M2 story is almost antidramatic. The most important thing about it may be how boring the reasons are. It survived because it had a clear role, because the role persisted, because the support system was massive, because allies used it, because platforms accepted it, and because replacement would require changing more than a gun. That is not a romantic explanation. It is a better one. It also explains why arguments about old equipment can become so emotional. Critics see age and imagine neglect. Defenders see service life and imagine proof of excellence. The institutional view is colder. It asks what the system costs, what it provides, what replacing it would disturb, and whether the alternative has matured enough to carry the same burden. In that view, the M2 is neither sacred nor embarrassing. It is deeply embedded. Old and obsolete are not the same word. Old is a relationship to time. Obsolete is a relationship to the job. A design becomes obsolete when the job changes or when another system solves the same job with enough advantage to justify the transition. The M2 remains historically important because it keeps forcing that distinction. So the Browning M2 is not merely a relic with a dramatic nickname. It is a case study in institutional endurance. It shows how an object can become a language that vehicles, crews, depots, and doctrines all understand. It shows why a military can be conservative without being irrational. And it shows why the hardest thing to replace is not always the weapon. Sometimes it is the world that has grown around it. That world includes the unglamorous people who keep old systems alive: armorers, mechanics, logisticians, instructors, vehicle crews, and procurement staff who inherit decisions made before they were born. Their work is part of the weapon's history. A design survives not only because it was drawn well, but because generations of institutions learned how to live with it. The final judgment, then, should be restrained. The M2 is not proof that old engineering is automatically better. It is proof that clear roles, stable logistics, and institutional learning can keep an old design relevant far longer than the calendar suggests. It survives because the question it answers has not disappeared, and because the world around it still knows how to apply that answer responsibly inside military doctrine. That is why the M2 is a better ending than a list of specifications would be. The specifications explain what the weapon is. The service life explains what the institution kept needing. A design can be technically old and institutionally current at the same time. The M2 forces that uncomfortable thought into the open. Sometimes the future does not replace the past. Sometimes it keeps paying rent to it. So the real story is not age alone. It is the bargain between age, role, and institutional gravity. The Browning M2 endures because that bargain has remained persuasive longer than almost anyone would have predicted. Its lesson is not nostalgia. Its lesson is that a clear role, once embedded deeply enough, can outlive generations of supposedly cleaner alternatives. That is endurance as an institutional fact, not a romantic claim. That distinction matters. That is the real reason old designs survive. Not because the calendar forgot them, but because the institution still knows what to do with them, and because the alternative has not yet made the old language too expensive to keep speaking.